This presentation is a part of our Let's Chat series, and so we'll be talking about Columbia's hidden car-centric culture. My name is Rikki Ascani. I'm Community Engagement Director at Local Motion. And so the point of this presentation is to kind of get us all questioning why our transportation system is the way that it is. To walk down a street or while you're driving and look at a road and think, what if I didn't have a car tomorrow? How would I get around? How would I get to my basic needs? And so to kind of alter your perspective about how cars dictate so much of our lives on a day-to-day basis. This presentation is not meant to guilt or blame anyone at all in any way. It's just meant to get us all thinking a little bit about and analyze our transportation system a bit. And so, like I said, I work for Local Motion. We're a small advocacy organization, transportation advocacy organization. And our vision is towns built for people where it is easy to walk, bike, and ride transit, and everyone can get where they want to go. And then our mission is to provide walking, biking, and transit solutions to meet people's everyday transportation needs. And so I'm probably going to say this again throughout the presentation, but our goal isn't to just like ban cars and have everyone sell their vehicle and walk or bike or take the bus wherever they want to go. That's not our point. Our point is to make sure that everyone can get where they need to go, no matter what mode of transportation they choose to use and what mode of transportation they are able to use. And so during this presentation, we'll talk about the history of streets and how we got to this car-centric lifestyle that a lot of us have now. How are we conditioned into this car-centric lifestyle? How does car centricity relate to Columbia specifically? And then where do we go from here? So first, we'll go over the history of our streets really quickly and how we got here in the first place. And so streets used to be as simple as folks would settle in an area, build some structures, houses, businesses, things like that, and you'd have a street in between them. And then they became these really bustling places of life where people strolled to and fro to different booths and got food and bought snacks and other things from vendors. And when they stepped off the sidewalk, if there even was a sidewalk, they did it anywhere they pleased. Pedestrians were pretty much king in this scenario. And then in the 1900s, the automobile came onto the scene. And at the turn of the century, motor vehicles were like these really expensive toys for really wealthy people. And they were pretty widely regarded as rare and dangerous. And roads were still seen as a pretty big public space especially for people walking and people biking and people who are using carts and horses and buggies and things like that. And so they were still seen as a public space, which all citizens using that space had an equal right to. Kids playing in the street, things like that. And if someone were to get hit by a motor vehicle, the laws always protected the person who was walking or biking because they are not using a heavier, dangerous object like a vehicle. And then things dramatically changed in 1908 when Henry Ford released the first Model T. Suddenly this car was super affordable and it was a lot faster than previous cars were. It went up to 45 miles an hour. And so like I said, it was really affordable. And so middle-class families were able to buy them mostly in cities. And then they began to just drive really fast through the streets, and they would run head on into pedestrians and kill them. And so by the 1920s, auto accidents, this is a wild statistic to me, auto accidents accounted for 2/3 of the entire death toll for cities of populations over 25,000 people. So Columbia is 120-ish thousand people. That means that 2/3 of people that died every year would be from car crashes, which is pretty wild. And then cars started adding a lot of danger to people who used the streets before they were invented, especially towards pedestrians. And so, of course, backlash towards vehicles happened. These destructive new vehicles came to the scene. And in the face of these rising death tolls, people started to fight back against them. My coworker Lawrence last week made a really good comparison to cars in the 1920s were kind of like how bird scooters are today. Obviously, bird scooters don't kill 2/3 of our population every year, but the backlash was kind of similar, that people were really angry at this new technology that came onto the scene about like, why do we need this? And so anti-car legislation loomed, and citizens and politicians understandably were wanting these things called like speed governors to limit how fast cars could go. And we're really trying to limit how much automobiles could take up their streets, that they were so used to being so predominantly pedestrian friendly. And so as I said before, people who owned cars were usually rich, wealthy people. And so car companies decided to fight back against all the hatred that they were getting. And so they targeted not behavior of cars, but then started targeting behavior of pedestrians. And so they would try to persuade people who lived in cities that it was a pedestrian's, like if you got hit by a car, it was your fault.
Oh my God.
And they would try and tell people that cities are for walking, not for driving, or they're for driving, not for walking in anymore. And so their most brilliant, horribly brilliant strategy was to invent this term called jaywalking, which we all know. A lot of us know that word today, but back then it was a really offensive term. A jay was kind of an offensive term for like a country bumpkin. Like if you were Jay coming into the city and you walked across the street and got hit by a car. And so pro-car forces would actively promote this term, and they would even have like Boy Scouts hand out little cards on the street to people walking saying you can only cross at the corner of the street, otherwise you'd be a jaywalker, and you would obviously don't want to be called that term, so you wouldn't do it. And jaywalking is even a law today still, and it's often a racist and classist law when it is enforced in cities. Again, car companies were able to do this because they had so much money and because people who drove cars were also often wealthy folks. And so in 1930, at the National Highway Users Conference, insurance companies, lobbyists, and others lobbied for more taxes to be spent on car-only infrastructure. And then in 1956, the Federal Highway Act designated what was called this like yellow book. It was essentially a blueprint for how to design our streets. And it was written by the auto industry. So of course, it benefited folks who were driving cars. And it laid out this plan that went right through cities. And now highways are great. They allow us to discover new places. I use highways all the time when I go on road trips and stuff. But the Federal Highway Act also enabled highways to just plow through existing cities and put little thought into other modes of transportation, like railways, for example. And so here's a photo that you can see this highway just essentially split this city into two, running right through it. And unfortunately, we know who suffered the worst from these highway projects: poor folks, and then, of course, people of color. The Federal Highway Act included money for, quote unquote, this urban renewal, which also was known as demolitions of neighborhoods that were designated by other people as poor neighborhoods, and were neighborhoods that were populated by mostly people of color. And so here is Black Bottom in this, let me turn my laser on really quick. In this blue square here, it's Black Bottom in Detroit in the 1950s. It's a thriving, close, and dense community. And then this highway was built through it. And now this is Black Bottom in Detroit in 2010. That highway just destroyed any community that existed there. And now there's some green space, but that's about it. And this happened in a lot of places, and it even happened a little bit in Columbia to some extent. I-70 runs along Columbia, but it didn't necessarily break up a ton of communities like it did with Black Bottom in Detroit here. But the urban renewal, as a part of that Federal Highway Act, did destroy predominantly Black neighborhoods and businesses called the Sharp End here in Columbia. And small towns all over Missouri have huge Missouri Department of Transportation roads just running right through them and disrupting any flow of pedestrian or biking traffic that was able to exist there before. And then on top of the Federal Highway Act, we had during the Great Depression, the Federal Housing Authority adjusted loan standards to get money in people's hands, which is great, but it only went into certain people's hands. Black and brown folks were often not able to get these loans. And the Federal Housing Authority, backed loans that had to meet these certain standards, like those that were often found in suburban neighborhoods that were only accessible by car. So folks were trying to buy these houses would get loans. They're mostly white people, and they would only get these loans for certain houses that were far out in the suburbs, not in city centers. And so they always needed a car to get to their homes and to get to their basic needs. And this program was great to some extent, but there were a lot of problems. This centralized homes and businesses away from each other. It segregated Black and brown people from white people. It redlined communities, which redlining is essentially what I talked about before, of how loan companies would essentially deny people a loan if they wanted to move into a certain neighborhood. And it was mostly discriminatory towards race. And it also enabled this car-centric zoning and city planning, and it didn't consider people using other modes of transportation besides cars. And so this kind of American dream that the Federal Housing Authority tried to create created neighborhoods like this. It allowed huge suburbs like this one to explode and allowed us to build farther out of town with these bigger lot sizes and greater distance between houses and businesses. Like you can see that these streets here just end. There's a highway right here. There's probably no businesses out there. Folks have to drive to get to their basic needs, making you need to own a car to get around. And this American dream created spaces like this in Columbia. This is Business Loop. I live really within walking distance of Business Loop. It created this wide expanse of streets where no one, I don't want to spend my Friday night there to explore the many small businesses on the Business Loop. There in these photos, there are obviously a lot of chain restaurants and stuff, but there are also a lot of really small, cool businesses on the Business Loop that I would love to explore, but I don't want to spend my night walking to and fro from those businesses across this essentially 5-lane highway. And it's also just doesn't look very pleasant to be on. There's no trees in sight. There's huge distances between crosswalks. You can see this person in this photo on the right is walking across that 5-lane road, because who wants to walk even a quarter mile out of their way to get across the street? I mean, this street is clearly prioritizing people who own a car, not folks who are walking and biking and taking the bus. And so just to recap, how did we get so reliant on cars? Of course, car lobbying and street design policies contributed immensely. Poor city planning, people of wealth and status making policy decisions. And the Federal Highway and Federal Housing Acts had a lot to do with it. And there are other things as well that we don't really have time to get to. And so what did this cause? It caused affordable housing issues, immense urban sprawl, an inequitable transportation system that made people rely on cars. And it made basic needs inaccessible in a lot of places for folks who don't own cars. Okay, so we talked about how did we get here, and now we're going to talk about how are we conditioned to kind of give in to this car-centered and car-centric culture that we live in the United States. And so to get into this, I wanted to share my transportation experience as a kid. I grew up in this tiny little, it's technically called a village of Ironton, Pennsylvania. It's really close to Allentown and Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, on the eastern side of the state there. We're not far, we're about 2 hours from Philly and New York City. And here's my neighborhood right here in the upper right-hand corner. I would not consider this a suburb necessarily. It's a small cluster of about 50 homes surrounded by a ton of farmland and cornfields. And now there's this road that to get out of our neighborhood, you have to turn on left or right onto. And so here's a photo of that road. It says it's 35 miles an hour here, but there is no way. People, including myself as a teenager and even as a young adult, go far faster on this road. I mean, it almost feels like a highway entrance ramp as you're going up this hill here. There's no way folks go 35 miles an hour. And if you do, the cars behind you are probably pretty angry about it. And so the only thing I knew as a kid or from being a kid to all the way to the age of 18 is having to hop in a car to get where I needed to go. Besides riding the bus, which was a school bus, not like a city bus to get to my basic needs, only to get to school, I only knew that driving a personal vehicle was how we got to our basic needs. And so this is the town of Ironton here, right here, this little dot. Calling it a town would be a bit generous, but there are basically no services within a 1+ mile radius of our neighborhood. So our neighborhood's right here. Here's the town of Ironton. There's a ton of green space and it's great. There's a ton of parks and things like that, but there's maybe a gas station, a really small family market. But again, you can't really get to any of those places without a car. So I can't help but think and ask the question, what if our car broke down? What if one of my parents lost their job and we couldn't afford to put gas in our vehicle? What would we do? Would we have to rely on our friends and neighbors? And you could argue then, and then choose to live in a place with public transportation, choose to live in a city or a city center or what have you, but that shouldn't have to be a question. My parents were public school teachers. They wanted to live where they wanted to live, and they deserve to have a choice in how they want to get where they need to go. They don't have the expertise of a city engineer on how to properly design our roads or how to advocate for that, and they shouldn't have to. We should have access to other systems of transportation to get where we need to go. And speaking of green spaces in my area, so this map of Ironton here, here's this awesome Ironton Rail Trail. And for folks that live in Columbia, the Ironton Rail Trail is very similar to the MKT and Katy trails. It's this amazing paved trail that leads to a ton of other trails in Pennsylvania, but to get there, you have to travel on roads that are kind of uncomfortable. They don't have sidewalks, they don't have bike lanes. And like as a kid, we still did it and felt comfortable as a child, but now starting working at Local Motion and as an adult, I realize kind of how uncomfortable it is to get to these green spaces. You shouldn't have to own a car and park in this parking lot just to access this trail and ride your bike or walk or run on this trail. And so for me, because of my transportation experience and so many other kids and teenagers in the United States, all I thought about, or not all I thought about, but when I turned 16, the only thing I knew was, oh, I get my license. I either get my older sister's car or I drive my parents' car, whatever, but I get my driver's license and I drive to get where I need to go. Because although I took the bus to school, I never really experienced public transportation or walking or biking to get where I needed to go. I experienced walking and biking as recreation, but never to get to like the grocery store or something like that. And we think, and especially as a teenager, but even now, I think a lot of us think that driving gives us this independence, when in reality, it creates such a harsh dependence on this one mode to get where we need to go. It marries us to only one lifestyle of owning a car and driving everywhere. And we kind of put all of our eggs in one basket when it came to our transportation system in the United States. And according to AAA, teens living in the Midwest tend to be licensed at younger ages, or 55% at or before the age of 16 and 70% before the age of 18. Whereas teenagers who live in big cities with access to other types of transportation often get licensed a lot later than teenagers who live in rural or small cities. And also the number of children and youth walking or biking to school has significantly declined over the last few decades. And the number being driven or driving has more than doubled over that same period. And cars have been around for over 100 years. And so technology of cars have changed, but cars have existed for 100 years now. But access, so that hasn't changed much, but the access to safe places to walk, bike, and ride the bus have, especially to places like schools, and communities have changed to prioritize cars. And the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention conducted this really interesting nationwide survey for parents and what prevented them from allowing their children to walk and bike to school. And overwhelmingly, first was distance, which is understandable, but the second thing was traffic danger. They either wouldn't walk or bike with their children or let them walk or bike themselves because they were afraid of car traffic. And so that kind of just enables this vicious cycle then, because then more parents drive their kids to school, adding to traffic. And so the cycle just keeps continuing and continuing. And I wanted to talk about how hard it is to disrupt the cycle of our individualistic nature of cars. We're so conditioned into loving these tiny little rooms on wheels. I mean, I own my own car, so I'm not innocent in this either. Having our own space, playing our own music as loud as we want, or deciding what type of car to buy and being really excited about it and running on our own time, getting to hop in our car at a moment's notice and go anywhere we want to in seconds. I mean, that's hard. It's a really hard system to reprogram and to disrupt our minds after a century of cars being king in the way that they have, in the way that we get around. I mean, like, for example, the Super Bowl. The Super Bowl is a huge event every year, and most of those commercials are car commercials. You don't see it seems really silly to say it now, but you don't see biking commercials during the Super Bowl. You don't see commercials about community. You see commercials about what kind of new fancy car you can buy. When you drive along the highway, you of course see dealerships plowed all along highways and other propaganda like that. And again, like I said, I own my own car. Like, I am not innocent in the system. A few people I work with own their own cars, and we are so ingrained that we don't even second guess spending hundreds of dollars a month on cars. So when I graduated from college and moved down to Miami for my first job, I graduated with a natural resources degree. It is not a money-making industry. I would work 2 jobs and over 60 hours a week sometimes just to save up for my own car. instead of experiencing the amazing culture and community in Miami. I mean, it's an amazing city. And so in 2018, right before I moved to Columbia, I bought my 2010 Subaru Outback for over $12,000, and I was able to put $7,000 down, but that still left me with over $5,000 to pay on it over 5 years. And so that monthly payment plus insurance, it was over $250 a month, but that didn't include things like gas. It's an older car. I still have it today. It's an old car. It needs repairs all the time. The cost of these external costs that I don't think about, like the contribution to climate change, the road damage my car causes, and the potential of getting into a car crash and injuring myself or injuring someone else. I never thought twice that spending over, probably when it all comes down to it, over $300 a month on something, when that money could have gone towards buying my first house or going on a really cool vacation. But instead it was an ingrained part of my budget. So we talked about how did we get here in the history of our streets, a little bit about how we are conditioned. And so now I'll get into how does car centricity relate to Columbia specifically. So here's the scale of Columbia in the late 1800s. It's about 1 square mile in this photo. And so now here's the huge size of Columbia today, which has fallen victim to a lot of the urban sprawl. It's about 13 square miles in this photo, which is understandable. More people, your city gets bigger, but it's also fallen victim to urban sprawl and suburban car culture that we talked about earlier with the history of streets. And so in the late 1800s, here's what the main thoroughfare of Columbia looks like. This is Broadway, and just a huge amount of folks milling about and going to businesses downtown, getting food and visiting other vendors, kind of like that first photo. It's very similar to that first photo I showed way back in the beginning of the presentation. And then the stark difference of when cars came onto the scene in the 1920s, how we used our landscape. So much space is taken up by vehicles now, and we transformed one of the largest economically prosperous places in town just for car traffic, and it's still very economically prosperous, but you can see just the stark difference in how we are using our streets in the late 1800s to the 1920s when cars came about, and how much stock we put into giving cars their own space and designing streets for those cars. And as we did this, the downtown became a place for local businesses rather than basic needs and services, which is still great. But now it's mostly a place for restaurants and shops and things like that, rather than like corner stores and whatnot. I love downtown Columbia. I feel safe walking here, but I definitely do not feel safe biking downtown. This is what it looks like today. And it's clear that we prioritize car traffic over people walking and biking and taking the bus. And I would love to take the bus downtown on a Friday night so that I don't have to worry about having a drink and getting home, or have to worry about finding a parking space and paying for that parking space. And we've just what used to be a huge mecca of people into the street where cars are calling a bulk of the shots. And like I said, as time went on, basic needs are moving farther and farther outside of downtown Columbia and to these really car-centric, inaccessible areas for people who don't own cars or don't want to drive. So for example, in this red square here, this is downtown Columbia. And then right above it to the north here, you have this really great neighborhood of affordable housing. People can walk, visit places downtown. There are schools and parks nearby, some social services provided by the city, but I would consider myself making a decent wage. I'm not going downtown for dinner every night. So folks in affordable housing are probably not going downtown for dinner every night. And here's the nearest grocery store to that affordable housing. It doesn't look far, but it's a half a mile away across a 2-lane, or sometimes even arguably more than 2-lane road, where it's very heavily trafficked. That grocery store is up a hill. And also Eat Well, which is what that grocery store highlighted in yellow there, is one of the most expensive grocery stores in Columbia. If you're a family of 2 or 4, you're not walking from that affordable housing all the way to that grocery store and carrying those groceries all the way back. That system was not set up to get people walking, biking, and busing where they need to go safely and accessibly. And another example is neighborhoods in Northern Columbia. Cars have allowed us, like I said before, to build outside of town without accounting for the fact that not everyone can or should have to afford a car. which I talked about, is a huge expense. I mean, I own a car and it's hard for me to afford to own my car at some points. And so here in this red square are a ton of northern neighborhoods in Columbia, and thousands of folks live in these neighborhoods. And then to the south, you have I-70 basically cutting it off from the rest of Columbia. And neighborhoods up north are obviously cheaper and for a larger amount of space than centrally located homes. And what if you can't afford a car or gas prices go up? Well, there is an option to take a bus up to these northern neighborhoods, but that transportation need is not prioritized here in Columbia. So if you take a look at these bus stops, this is a bus stop right north of I-70. There's no bench, there's no sidewalk, there's cars going, the speed limit says 45 miles an hour here. Cars are going far faster than that on this essentially 4-lane small highway. It's just not a pleasant experience. And then even farther up north, you have a bus stop up here. At least there's a sidewalk, but there's no shelter, there's no shade, there's no bench. Our buses only run every 45 minutes. Can you imagine standing at these stops for that long? Especially like yesterday in that over 100-degree heat. No one wants to stand at that bus stop for that long. And so what are you going to do if the bus system is just not for you? You can't make it work. It's uncomfortable. It's not convenient. You obviously can't walk all the way from Northern Columbia to Southern Columbia to your job or what have you. You're going to drive, and no one should have to spend over $9,000 a year just to get to work or to get to groceries, to pick up their child from school or to visit green spaces. And then I really quickly wanted to touch on why so many folks have to live in northern neighborhoods in Columbia. These neighborhoods are our neighborhoods with some of the highest populations of Black and brown folks, of people of low income, and folks that don't drive cars. Gentrification and displacement play so much into our transportation system. And so for those of you that don't know, gentrification is a process which a historically poorer area experiences an influx of middle class or wealthy people who renovate and rebuild and then resell homes. And it often results in increased property values. And also the area, not just the homes, but also the areas around them change. Like, let's say they put in sidewalks or bike lanes, little shops or something like that. And so prices of properties go up, and it displaces other people, usually less wealthy residents. And so this blue square down at the bottom of the screen, in the middle there, that blue dot, that's where I live. And I live in a predominantly Black neighborhood that is being rapidly gentrified. And I am part of that gentrification. And fixing up neighborhoods and adding bike lanes and sidewalks and bus stops is never bad. We never want to discourage that from happening. Displacement is what's bad. And so we want good infrastructure for people everywhere so that people don't have to choose between affording rent and getting where they need to go safely. And so this is one of our neighborhood leaders, Sophia Smith. She's essentially saying that lower income neighborhoods and neighborhoods up north, like where she lives, just feels like to her that they're just being overlooked, that they aren't even thought about when it comes to the transportation system and a ton of other inequities. And so horribly great example of that is Clark Lane in northeastern Columbia. This area has tons of people living and walking off of it. The percentage of people walking and biking to get where they need to go is much higher in this area, yet the streets prioritize car users. So if you look at these sidewalks here on both sides of the road, they just abruptly end. And a 17-year-old, Claudine, was walking home from work at McDonald's at night and was hit and killed. She was 17 years old. That sidewalk, 3 years later, we just went there to this area like 3 weeks ago, maybe. It looks exactly the same. It's in the same exact condition, gravel and all. Her life is worth so much more than prioritizing getting cars where they need to go over Claudine getting home safe from work at night. And transportation is just so ingrained in our society. I mean, we rely on transportation so much for everything that we do. Access to multiple modes of safe transportation, whether that be, maybe it is a car, maybe it's buses or walking or biking or a subway, enables us to have access to basic needs like healthcare, services to disrupt the cycle of homelessness and poverty, gets us to jobs, to traveling and experiencing new places. Say your car is in the shop for a few days. an equitable transportation system enables you to take the bus to work or buy groceries without having to worry about how you're going to get where you need to go when you don't have your car for a few days. You can access wild spaces that are so beneficial for our mental and physical health. Access to schools and childcare. Services provided by the city, like advocating for certain policies, voting, social services. Say you have a temporary disability or you're a person with a disability. An equitable transportation system means that you can get where you need to go safely and conveniently. You can access healthy foods. And access to multiple modes of transportation during, say, a bout of high gas prices means that you don't have to choose whether to buy that healthy food right there or put gas in your tank. And also visiting friends and family and creating a community that is also so beneficial for our mental health. And so much more that's not on this slide that is dependent on transportation. And without access to safe places to bike, walk, and take the bus where we need to go, with the priority our society puts on cars, we continue this cycle of poverty, of transportation inconvenience, of inequity and danger for people who are simply trying to get where they need to go. And part of my job as community engagement director is simply engaging with the community, whether that means individuals, other nonprofits, businesses, organizations. These folks are often outside of our membership, and a lot of the other organizations that we work with are direct service-based organizations who work with folks who can't get where they need to go. So for example, like the Central Missouri Recovery Coalition, they're made up of over 40 direct services organizations trying to work with folks who are trying to take a step towards recovery. Or we talk to people at the bus station, or we talk to people at our focus groups, or we talk to our neighborhood leaders who are pillars in our community, in their community, and we talk to other nonprofits like the food bank, the food pantry, refugee organizations, and the list goes on, but that overwhelmingly people cannot get where they need to go in Columbia without relying, if they don't have a car, without relying on, like, say, friends or family, or if they're working with a direct service organization, relying on that direct service organization to provide them a ride somewhere, or just that they simply can't get around at all. If they don't own a car, they just have to choose to not get where they need to go that day. And so in our line of work, we talk a lot about transportation and accessing our basic needs, like I talked about before, doctor's offices, your jobs, school, groceries. But I also wanted to take a moment to talk about not just your basic needs, but also your access to enables people to thrive, which life isn't just about working and buying groceries and shuttling kids or chores. It's about recreation too. And holding green spaces hostage for only people who have cars is unacceptable. Just because you don't own a car doesn't mean you shouldn't be able to access beautiful green spaces like this. So this is Rockbridge State Park, a little bit south of Columbia. It's a beautiful, huge piece of land that you can take a bus to about a mile from Rockbridge, but then the road to Rockbridge is about 45 miles an hour. There's no bike lane or sidewalk. No one's gonna take the bus out there and then walk to Rockbridge. It's just not going to happen. And this is a huge piece of beautiful land that people should, especially young people, should get to experience. You shouldn't have to own a car to get there. And also folks in Northern Columbia can't even access or bike safely to prominent trails like the MKT because we built streets up north for folks driving cars, and our trail connections haven't really met the mark yet in getting people who live in other areas of town to have the same access to these beautiful green spaces and trails like folks who live more centrally or south of town do. And then I wanted to talk about the Columbia Airport really quick, which is just an inexplicably small airport. And I found this picture online that just, it's hard not to laugh at. So it says, Columbia's brand new terminal will be built for you. Now we know that people of a certain economic status, myself included, are not flying out of Columbia's airport. There's no way. It's 30 minutes outside of town. There's no public transportation or affordable shuttles that run there for people. And my question is, why are we prioritizing money to bring people to our city and boost our local economy, which is true. It might boost our local economy when we can't even get folks in Columbia where they need to go. For our public transit and paratransit system, we have a ridership of over 400,000, yet the budget for the airport is a little bit more than our public transit system, yet gets a quarter of the ridership. And this is to say that driving and flying are just such ingrained systems in us that we think that this little airport will stimulate our economy and will be good to spend our money on, rather than getting folks in Columbia where they need to go by biking, walking, and taking the bus. And we've even held focus groups this spring and asked the question of folks, if you could walk and bike and ride the bus where you needed to go, like say downtown Columbia, would you spend more money at businesses? And if you didn't have to drive? And overwhelmingly, most, if not all, were solid yeses that they would spend more money. And so if we can get folks where they need to go in Columbia to stimulate our economy that way first, and then focus on things like Columbia's regional airport, that would be great. And let's use Business Loop as an example. So this is Business Loop in the 1950s, right around when that Federal Highway Act was established and implemented. And the street looks like it was meant for cars. And now, over 70 years later, with all that we know about equity and transportation infrastructure and what sprawl does to our communities, and how many Business Loop has probably been updated in those 70 years, it looks virtually the same with an addition of a sidewalk, and that's about it. And so this is Garth Avenue. On the right here, we have South Garth by the famous Columbia Library. I love the library and this area. Our offices are in this area. This street looks really, really pleasant to be on. And then you go about 2 to 3 miles to North Garth, and that street looks completely different. Cars move faster. There are no shade trees. I would much rather spend my time in that picture on the right. And so many of us who drive or walk or bike through these areas, before I worked at Local Motion, I know I didn't give it a second thought of how folks get where they need to go. Like, I didn't stroll past that neighborhood in North Garth and think, well, I hope they have a car because this is really unpleasant to walk on. And that's what I challenge you all to do after this presentation, is to really analyze the spaces around you and think, why was this built this way? And same for these neighborhood streets in Northern Columbia on the right compared to Southern Columbia. So that picture on the left of Southern Columbia, it was built a long time ago and looks narrower and really pleasant compared to this neighborhood street in Northern Columbia that was built not that long ago. Both of these streets have the same speed limit of 25 miles an hour, which is wild. Which one would you rather travel on by biking, walking, or wait at a bus stop at? And which one do you think you need a car to get where you need to go if you lived in that neighborhood? And do you think there are any businesses nearby on this street in Northern Columbia versus that street in Southern Columbia? So people should not have to choose between emptying out their bank account or securing a job or having new experiences just to drive a car to get where they need to go. People have the right to options. And some people just have never, as a privileged middle-class white woman, I've had so many transportation options in my life. And some people do not have access to that parts of the system that I did, or I've never had to experience certain parts of the system that other people do. And we have hundreds, if not potentially thousands, of refugees that have settled in Columbia over the years, and especially over the past 18 months. So this is our neighborhood leader, Caritas, and she was a refugee decades ago and has lived in Columbia for over 20 years. And she's a pillar in her community. She tries to help folks just coming to the US, and so many people who are used to walking and biking or transit to get around move here and are at a loss on how to use our transportation system safely. Like, even just to cross the street, they don't even know how to navigate it, because you can tell it's just so much so set up for cars. And a lot of folks even have their driver's license in the country that they came from, but can't get their driver's license here because of language barriers, and are forced to find another way to get to their basic needs, which are essential when you're just resettling into a new place. And since refugees don't have the money to live in centralized areas where their basic needs are easily accessed, they rely on Caritas to drive them around to doctor's appointments, childcare, and other services. And one of the things Caritas said to me was that we don't see the flaws in our system until people coming from other transportation systems resettle here, and then their flaws just become our flaws. Our transportation system's flaws become so much more apparent. And then this is Dawn, another one of our neighborhood leaders. So Dawn primarily uses her wheelchair to get around town. People with disabilities are yet another group of folks forgotten about with regards to our car-centric transportation system. So a few months ago, Dawn was hit and luckily not injured by a car in the middle of a crosswalk on a commute. The person driving the car got out and had the audacity to tell her to be safe. This is what Dawn wears when she is using her wheelchair. I don't know what more she could do to be seen by this person driving a vehicle. She's got a flag, a yellow pole, she wears a hat and has a jacket hanging on the back of her wheelchair. Like I simply don't know what more she could do, and she shouldn't have to. But our transportation system doesn't prioritize people like Dawn using a wheelchair to get around. They prioritize people who hit people like the person who hit Dawn in this huge vehicle, and innately think that that system is made for them. And so my coworker Heather shared this really cool graphic with us a few weeks ago that kind of tries to explain the difference between inequality, equality, equity, and justice. And so I wanted to kind of apply that to our transportation system. And so inequality in our transportation system is prioritizing cars over everything, and maybe having some infrastructure for bikes and for people walking. And so a good example of a street would be like Providence. Someone at this bus stop years ago was also killed. There's no sidewalk here. There's no bike lanes. That bus stop is not very safe and comfortable to be at. And then we have equality. So that's giving cars, bikes, buses, and people walking all equal treatment on the road. And so a good example of that might be a street like Nifong, where Nifong is a 50-mile-an-hour road. It looks like it was built for cars. Here's a bike lane right here. There's a sidewalk that kind of ends, but there is infrastructure for everyone. There's a sidewalk on the other side of the road, but it doesn't feel safe or comfortable for people to use. But the person who designed this road can say, okay, we did our jobs. We provided an equal amount of infrastructure for everyone using this road. But transportation equity is prioritizing people who walk, who bike, and who take public transportation. And again, this isn't to say that we want to ban cars and no one should ever drive again. It's to say that we know when we prioritize vulnerable road users, like people who are walking and biking and taking the bus, we know that roads are innately safer for people who are driving cars. And so a great example of this is the street rendering of Ash Street that runs east to west in Columbia. So you can see when the infrastructure there goes away in just a second. So this is what Ash Street looks like right now. And so then we've rendered this infrastructure over top of it. There's a pedestrian shared use pathway. There's a great raised crosswalk going across the street that encourages drivers to slow down. There are sidewalks on both sides of the road. The street works for everyone. It works for people driving cars and other people using the road as well. And then, so what is transportation equity and justice combined? So justice essentially means providing extra support for folks in a system. And so this would be providing money and consistent funding and design updates for people who are using our transportation system, especially those who are walking, biking, and taking the bus. Okay, so we've talked about the history of how we got here, how are we conditioned, how does car centricity relate to Columbia, and now we're going to talk about where do we go from here. And so, like I said, Local Motion is a transportation advocacy organization. And so what the best things we can do are advocate for new policies, prioritize it. We're not asking the city or any other entity to spend more money necessarily. Sometimes maybe yes, but we're asking them to prioritize their money in a different way, to design our streets with all users in mind, not as afterthoughts, and to build and develop progressive infrastructure as it changes and evolves. I mean, our transportation system is always changing, and the important part is to keep up with that and to know what vulnerable road users want to see in the transportation system and how that system can benefit the most people. We've made choices and policy choices when it comes to our transportation system. It was a choice to design Business Loop like this instead of like this. And it is a choice to design a road like this and consistently not update it while updating other parts of the city. It is a policy choice to for a young woman to lose her life just trying to walk home on this road and not extend the sidewalks or change what that street looks like, instead of giving her a space like this to walk home safely. It is a policy choice to put a bus stop on a road like this and ask someone to risk their life just trying to take the bus where they need to go, instead of giving them even something as simple as a shelter to wait under, or a bench, not even a sidewalk or anything else. And so we have choices within our transportation system. And one of those choices, so we created our Como Livable Streets campaign based upon the choice that we want to make, which is to have the city update our street designs. This isn't a plug for our Livable Streets campaign. I don't care if you look at the website or sign the petition or anything, but we have a choice now to ask City Council to update our street design standards and make transportation safer and more accessible for people who walk, bike, and take the bus. And we want them to make the choice to prioritize folks, because we know that so many people in Columbia cannot get where they need to go on a daily basis. If you do want to learn more about the Como Livable Streets campaign, you can go to comostreets.org. It is our campaign website. There's a bunch of information on there, or you can always email me at this email address in the bottom left-hand corner. And that is all I have for you all. Does anyone have any questions, concerns? Wow, that is a lot of blank screens.
I really want to ask you a question, Rikki, but I just want to say that was really fantastic. I think you did a really good job and really brought the point home about prioritizing different street infrastructure. So thank you for that.
Of course. Anyone else have any questions?
Well, I think a lot of it, number one, it was an excellent presentation. I really enjoyed it, but it all comes down to money when you look at those, I'll just call them a bus stop, where you can enclose and have people not be in the weather conditions. All that stuff comes down to money. And unfortunately, we don't prioritize that for those that don't have cars. And that will always be the struggle, but I appreciate your insight on these things. And unfortunately, our culture in the United States is the car is ingrained into our society, and it's difficult to break that. As much as we try, it's difficult to do so.
Yeah. Thanks, Dad.
But I mean, even people that live in a small town, I'll use an example where I grew up. There's no supermarket in the town. It's very, I wouldn't say desolate. It's there's just not a lot of conveniences there for someone that lives in a town of 6,000 people to get their basic needs on it and make it easy. It's just not. So it's not only the bigger cities, but small towns face the same thing. And I'm sure it's the same in Missouri, where people have to drive to buy their groceries or clothes or whatever, because if you buy it in town, it's extremely expensive because it's a small market. And it's just difficult. I think even if you choose to live in a town and limit your use of using a car, it's very difficult to meet your basic needs without driving, because that's the way things are. It just has changed dramatically in the last 75 years of not only our larger cities, but our small towns as well.
Yeah. Jackson, who's on the works in our statewide arm, and I'm sure he has a lot of insight to that, but it is a big struggle in Missouri. I mean, that's why Walmarts exist.
Right.
Not why, but one of the reasons.
Could jump in for just a second. It's interesting because some towns, I was at a farm to fork summit in February in a town of less than 1,000 people that maintains a grocery store just fine. There was somebody that spoke from Nebraska and also somebody from Kansas who came from, and one who had started a local grocery store that kind of ran out of their farm as a general store, and then also took in other local food options from other businesses in the area, other farms and things like that. And they're able to support a very successful grocery store just for the 300 people of the town. So there's a way to go back to that, but the continued investment of Casey's general store, like convenience stores, the focus on those convenient, easy options makes it really hard to compete with that. So that's a whole other aspect of things that we need to try to address.
Mhm. Thanks, Jackson. Anyone else have any questions, comments? No? All right. Well, thank you all very much. I appreciate you dedicating your Wednesday afternoon to watching this. Have a good one.